Order, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of the Justice Select Committee, which we have the privilege to be asking questions of the Lord Chancellor on her first 6 months in office. So welcome, Lord Chancellor, and thank you very much for joining us, giving your time up this afternoon. Just before we go straight into questions, we have to do, on each occasion, our declarations of interest. So I will begin going around the horseshoe, beginning with Sir Ashley.
As declared in the register.
I'm a practising barrister with an active practising certificate.
Vice Chair of Whistleblowers UK. And a Director of... Vice Chair of the APPG on whistleblowing and a Director of Whistleblowers UK.
I'm a non-practising barrister. I'm a patron of the Hammersmith Law Society and the Upper Room Charity and a member of the Unite and GMB trade unions.
Nothing to declare beyond what's in the register.
Afternoon. I hold a practising certificate from the SRA. I'm a member of GMB and Unite unions, and I'm also just an ordinary member of the APPG on whistleblowing.
Good afternoon. I am a non-practising solicitor, formerly of the Crown Prosecution Service. My declaration of interest are on the register, but of note, I am the mission delivery champion for the Safer Streets mission.
My interests are as declared on the register.
I'm a solicitor and a member of the GMB Union Executive Council and a member of a number of APPGs.
Thank you very much. Lord Chancellor, you're making so many announcements recently that it's difficult to know where to start.
Period.
But we're going to start with prisons. Last week we had the 10-year strategy and the annual analysis as well. But looking at that, it showed that HMPPS could run out of prison places as early as November next year. And a lot of hope seemed to be rested on the sentencing review as dealing with that. But do you expect to have implemented the outcome of that review in time to avoid that first potential pinch point in November next year?
So there's quite a lot in that, if I might just draw back a little bit. The strategy, the 10-year capacity strategy and the annual statement, the annual statement is the first of its kind and sets out properly for the first time supply and demand. And you're right that of course, we have a supply side to deliver in order to try and make sure that we don't run out of prison places before any changes as a result of the sentencing review might be made. But there's also a demand side that we have to think about. And as you referenced in your opening remarks, that's why I've had to make a series of announcements already. So almost as soon as I walked into the department in July of this year, I became aware that we were, days and weeks away from disaster in the prisons. So I had to take an emergency measure immediately and have announced a couple of other operational measures. I think in the statement, the point at which the two lines, cross over on supply and demand is actually into spring of 2026. But what I would note is the picture is very tight and it is going to be difficult. And I've made no sort of secret of that, as it were, in all my pronouncements at the House, my various oral statements. I've made clear that if there is a requirement for further measures, I will return to the House at the first opportunity. And I cannot rule out that I might have to take further measures to make sure we don't run out of prison places and don't face the situation we faced when I walked into the department in July. Is it something that I can guarantee one way or the other? I'd say no. We're keeping a very close eye on exactly what's happening on demand, day by day, week by week. I receive regular updates as to whether we're on our central demand projection or above it or below it, but as you will know, there are some things that just happen that you could not have predicted, and the summer of disorder that we had earlier on this year is a very good example of that. So these are projections based on best evidence, experience and judgment. Of course, sometimes events will overcome.
I think the point we're trying to get to, because you have been very frank, that even if the new places are delivered on time, that will not be sufficient.
Yes.
You expect, which gives us an idea about where the sentencing review is going, that will contribute to demand. But it also looks like that's not enough. So what other steps is the MOJ considering to bridge that capacity gap? Projections showing a shortfall of 12,400 places by the end of 2027. So doesn't that mean overcrowding is going to get worse, and that again we may be running out of places?
Well, so I think the 12,400 number is actually from the NAO report rather than from the MOJ's projections, which are contained in the statement and also the 10-year strategy. That's because, by the way, I believe that's because when the NAO did their report, they were, at that point, SDS 40 and the other operational measures on home detention, curfew and risk assessed re-release were not accounted for, which is why the gap is bigger. In a way, that highlights the scale of the problem. So the emergency measures and the operational measures are contributing to preventing us, obviously, from running out of places. I mean, it accounts for quite big numbers. And, of course, that's why I've announced the sentencing review as quickly as I have and put them on a tight timetable, and therefore myself and the department, because we are so close to the line that I want to try and get the system not just beyond making sure that it doesn't topple over, but to a more sustainable position as quickly as possible. And I think that whether we're adrift, the NAO's number is much bigger because it doesn't take account of the other measures. But even with the other measures taken account of, by 2027 you're sort of 5,500 places adrift. So it shows you the scale of the problem and the task that we've sent the sentencing review in that context.
Yeah, I mean, nobody envies your position on this, and you're taking a number of stopgap measures, such as, there's rapid deployment cells with a lifespan of 15 years, using house blocks, using an early release, I mean, effectively dealing with an immediate crisis. And the sentencing review may provide some relief through alternatives to custody for short sentences. But don't you need to be looking at determinate sentences? Don't you need to be looking at the sentencing inflation that has taken place over the past 20, 30 years if you're going to actually control prison numbers?
Well, the sentencing review has a much broader remit, and it is looking at sentencing policy in the round, and that's quite clear from the terms of reference. And the three principles that underpin the sentencing review are that, first and foremost, we cannot run out of prison places, and we've got to have a prison place available for everybody that has to be locked up, because they're a danger to the public. We do also have to do better at rehabilitating people whilst they're in prison, helping them to turn their lives around. That's a good strategy for cutting crime, as I say, because they need to come out better citizens rather than better criminals. And then also we've got to expand the use of punishment outside of prison as well. So the remit is broader than simply looking at, as you've said, short sentences. And within that, I've asked them to also consider specific cohorts. So looking at prolific offenders specifically, also on how we respond to offences that relate to violence against women and girls. And there are specific things I've tasked them to look at. So it is a much broader review than maybe the exercise, I guess, that you might be referring to, which is what led to the last Conservative government's attempt at a sentencing bill towards the end of the last Parliament. This is much broader.
You would welcome looking at the issue of longer sentences.
Well, I've asked them to look at sentencing overall, and what I welcome is them looking at my terms of reference and providing us with some solutions within those terms of reference. They are aware, and I've discussed with the panel chair, obviously the necessity of being able to live within our means on prison capacity. That's why making sure that capacity is always able to hold those that need to be locked up must always be there, because we can't be in the position which I've inherited, where we're making emergency release mechanisms. I mean, the last Conservative government was doing end of custody supervised licence, a form of emergency release. I've had to do SDS 40. I would like to rule those out and get the system to sustainability. And the sentencing review is crucial to that. I think it's the first time any government has accepted you've got to look at both supply and demand, which is a big change in policy, and that can only come from a review of this kind.
A lot of money being spent on new prisons, not so much on the existing prisons, some of which are in a frankly disgraceful condition. Maintenance backlog is now estimated at 1.8 billion. the 10-year strategy says £220 million on maintenance the current financial year, 300 in next financial year. Aren't the conditions in prison just going to get worse under that?
Well, I would just challenge the beginning of your question because for 24-25, the allocation effectively that I inherited, which we have retained, was 220 million. For 25-26, which is the sort of phase one of our review process as a new government, is 300 million. I'm determined to keep making progress. I mean, maintenance and new supply are both equally important. We cannot be in a position where, due to dilapidations, we lose more places than we would anticipate in the normal run of things. So making sure that we stay on top of maintenance is incredibly important. We've allocated more money to it in our first year, and obviously we'll be now going into the next phase of the spending review process.
Would you like to see an end to conditions such as where two people are sharing a cell for one, and there are open toilets and people are having to go to the toilet at the same time as people are eating in a very small room?
I mean, look, I think we've got to make my priorities for the progress on maintenance are on fire safety, where I think we're working closely with the Fire Safety Inspectorate, and there's a plan to, over the next 2 to 3 years, get the whole of the estate right up to spec on fire safety. And obviously I want to maintain a safe estate, not just for prisoners, but also for the prison officers that work within it, and working very closely with HMPPS to make sure that is what we deliver. On the crowding, that is to say, cells built for one that are currently housing two. Of course, in the long run, you would want to make progress. I wouldn't wish to suggest to the committee that is going to be easily achievable in the next year or two. My understanding of the previous Conservative government's record on this was previous Lord Chancellors had sort of worked as closely as they could with HMPPS to get to the maximum tolerable level of crowding within the estate without compromising on the safety of staff and others. So there isn't any capacity in the estate to crowd further than what we currently have. In the long term, I would like to see that come down. Of course I would, but there are other priorities for prison maintenance first and foremost, and that does relate, I have to say, to fire safety particularly.
Thank you. That is a very important point. That's all for me for now. If I can go to Pam Cox.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The outcome of the sentencing review may lead to significant changes in the future demand for prison places, as we've just discussed. So I wonder how it's possible to set out a 10-year prison capacity strategy before that review is complete.
Well, look, I announced that we would put a capacity strategy before the House before the end of the year. It is based on current policy. I think it's right to talk about the supply that will be needed, because the supply is required as a necessary way of squaring this circle to make sure that we've got the prison places that we need. So supply and demand are both part of the solution here, and I think it's important that I've set out where we can go with supply. And obviously, a lot of this supply will be baked into our modelling for where we see, potential future shortfalls in prison places. So I think it's important to set that out, which I have done so. But of course, I'm not suggesting this is the complete picture, because of course demand is important as well, and that's why we've got the sentencing review working. As I came in, of course, I announced the emergency measures straight away. I think it's right that I took a little bit of time to think about what the more medium to long-term solutions will be. So I appreciate not all of these have correlated in timings necessarily, but that relates more to the pressure of needing to do an emergency release upon entering office.
Thank you, Lord Chancellor. And on the question of timing, do you think 6 months is enough time to deliver a landmark review, as it's been described?
Well, look, I thought about the timings for the review very, very carefully, and I guess there would have been an argument to possibly push for an even faster timeline. I wanted to give the review enough time to consider the issues properly whilst also working at pace. It's why I asked for David Gauke to lead the review, because he's a former Lord Chancellor. He knows this area well. He's leading an expert panel, all of whom have relevant expertise. So the usual amount of work that might be required to read into a topic, get across what's currently happening, I think we've been able to, because of the expertise of the people that are involved, move that much more quickly. These are all people that know this territory well, and therefore some of that background work isn't required. There is no doubt they're working at pace. I mean, this was it was always an ask of the panel chair. It's something I discussed with David Gauke on timing specifically, but he was happy to try to do this within the 6 months, and that is the agreement we have.
Thank you. And in terms of the scope of the review, we're interested in the fact that remand is not included, given that remand plays such an important part in prison capacity and so many prisoners are held on remand currently. Is the government planning any future work on remand specifically?
So I think about remand very carefully. I didn't place everything into the scope of the review, partly because it's got a very tight timetable. I wanted to make sure that the work we'd asked them to do specifically around sentencing and the profile of sentencing that they could do. On remand specifically also, there are a number of other measures. I mean, the size of the remand population is intimately connected. I'm sure we'll discuss this later in the session, but with the size of the Crown Court backlog as well. Those two things essentially go hand in hand, and not all of those levers would have been levers that the review would have been able to consider how they might be pulled. And of course, listings is a judicial function. So the situation in remand I thought was sufficiently different to what else is happening. It is definitely a problem when it comes to prison capacity, and I want to make progress on remand, but I didn't think that was best done within the sentencing review.
And a final one from me. When will legislation be brought forward to implement the 2 outstanding wage review recommendations on statutory aggravating factors for murder involving strangulation and those connected with the end of a relationship?
So I believe that there is a statutory requirement for a consultation with the Sentencing Council. So I would expect the relevant legislation next year. I can write back to the committee on exact timings, because I don't believe it's immediately in the new year, but soon thereafter, because there is a requirement, I think, for a consultation with the Sentencing Council, but I will write to you with the details.
Thank you. We would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to go back to the prison population, if I may, for just a moment, in particular in relation to foreign national offenders within our prisons, and would like to ask how the department is approaching deportation of foreign national offenders in the context of addressing the prison capacity issues that we're facing.
It's absolutely a priority to make as much progress as possible with deportations of foreign national offenders, and to make sure that the early removal scheme works as intended. Obviously, we have to work very closely with the Home Office, because the deportations and removals fall within their remit, but we are on course this year to deport more than the same time last year. And last year was a good, in fairness to the previous Conservative administration, last year was a good number, and we are set to increase it and go further this year. And I want to keep making progress. What I have committed to in the House, and something that we are looking at, and we'll be working closely with other colleagues in government on, is whether we can make the early removal scheme function more effectively, and whether there's an argument to bring forward the point at which somebody becomes eligible for early removal from the country. There's a trade-off there that's inherent, which is requirements of justice to be served in this country versus removal back to country of origin, and I'm sure victims and other groups will have comments on that. My own personal view, which I've held for some time before I came into this brief, was immediate deportation, if you imagine it as a modern form of exile, to me is punishment too. But it's obviously a conversation to have both in government and then a wider public debate about. But from the system we have inherited, we are on course for more deportations this year than previous years, and that is progress that I'm pleased to see, and we will continue working with the Home Office to push that as quickly as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Josh Babarinde.
Hi, Lord Chancellor. Thanks for joining us. My first set of questions are on the SDS 40 scheme. And we heard from Lord Timpson before, as well as the likes of Amy Rees, about when the scheme would be reviewed. And it would be good to understand from you, because we know that next autumn is when a review is likely to take place. What are the outcomes or indicators, the performance measures you're going to be assessing the success or not of the scheme against?
So what I've committed to is reviewing within 18 months of its implementation. So it was implemented in September of this year. 18 months hence is sort of my timeline for that review. I wouldn't want to get ahead of what that future review is going to look at. I'm sure it will consider many of the factors that you have indicated. I haven't yet designed that future review process, if I may say so, but I'd be very happy to consider representations for what others think needs to be looked at. Essentially, though, I think we have to accept it is a capacity reduction measure. It's an emergency response to the fact that we were about to run out of prison places. And of the levers at my disposal, this was the one that was most likely and most capable of preventing us from running out of prison places. And I know members of the committee are aware, by the final week in August, we'd gone down to fewer than 100 places. And SDS 40, the first tranche, were released on the 10th of September. And so between the end of August and September the 10th was a very difficult period. And it was still possible in that period for us to run out completely. And members might remember Operation Early Dawn and some of the other mechanisms that the last Conservative administration had brought in were being operated then to stop us from running out. So it's an emergency measure, and I guess its fundamental requirement in terms of efficacy is, has it in fact yielded prison places? And to which obviously we all know the answer is yes. It has given us some more headroom on capacity to prevent us from running out. There are other questions on its implementation, which I will want to look at, but actually, as I believe Amy Rees and others have already been speaking to this committee about, there's already been a lessons learned exercise between tranche 1 on the 10th of September and tranche 2 on the 22nd of October, because we set quite a hard challenge for probation in particular to try and maintain business as usual planning for releases, even though they were on a tight timetable. And I'm very, very proud of the probation staff who worked so hard and so diligently over the summer. And actually, I think that for the most part, the system was able to perform at a very, very good level. But of course, we'll be reviewing any further changes that need to be made.
Sure. And I'm sure we will all agree with you in praising the probation staff and all MOJ staff who were involved in helping to make...
They all had a very busy summer, and we do owe them a debt of gratitude.
Absolutely. But on that question of, the criteria that you're using to review this at the end of the 18 months, it strikes me as a missed opportunity not to have set those criteria, at least internally, now, or when the scheme began, so that as the scheme was rolling, you could be making an assessment against the same criteria now that you'd be using then. But I will accept your invitation to submit examples of criteria going forward.
Forgive me, just to observe, I think it's the scheme has been designed based on the levers that are available to me from a legislation perspective, i.e. what measures could I implement to prevent us running out of prison places, and so I guess in a way all I would say is it's in the nature of the change that it's legislative, and I thought that the best thing to do was to look at it again in 18 months' time to see how it's functioning and whether it's still needed or not, which will of course be also informed by the sentencing review. When I walked into office, I did not of course at that point announce a sentencing review. The sentencing review has come as a result of looking at the system and thinking about how we might get it to longer term sustainability. If you see what I mean, they're not, I appreciate the timeline looks like it's a bit out of sync, as it were, because on top of this you now have the sentencing review, but it would not have been possible to do any different than what happened because the situation was far starker upon entering office than I think anybody had realised.
Well, on kind of one of the criterion that I think should be used to assess the efficacy. The extent to which victims and survivors of domestic abuse are protected, I think, must be one of them. And I'd be keen to understand from you that despite the assurances given to exclude as many domestic abusers as possible from being released early under the scheme, do you accept that there are people who are abusers but convicted of offences like ABH, common assault, GBH, are eligible for early release? Do you accept that that is the case?
As you and I have discussed on a number of occasions in the House during orals, it is the case that by law you can only exclude offence types rather than cohorts of offenders. I do not have a legislative lever at my disposal to prevent the release of a particular cohort of offenders, much as I would have liked to have had such a lever, but that is not possible. In law, it is only possible to exclude by offence type, and which is why I chose the offences that I did, which are offences that are most closely connected to taking place in domestic abuse type environment. So on coercive control, on non-fatal strangulation, breach of restraining orders, we know that almost all of those offences, when committed, are done so because of domestic abuse. There is not an offence of domestic abuse, which I think is the sort of common misunderstanding. Maybe a lot of people who have committed assault might have done so in the context of an abusive relationship where they've abused their partner. It has not been possible to obviously exclude all. You'd have to exclude all common assault in order to prevent that that scenario that you're describing from happening. I think that is one of the reasons, though, going forward, that I've asked David Gork and the panel to look at the way that we sentence in relation to those who commit violence against women and girls. Specifically, that is a focus of this government, and that's why I've asked the sentencing review specifically within their terms of reference to look at that. It's partly learning the lessons of, looking to see what levers I could pull and discovering that this is on offences rather than offender cohort.
You spoke about not having access to the legislative levers. Of course, as the government, you can create those levers. In fact, it was one of the Director Generals for Policy, Prisons, Offenders and Analysis who came in and spoke to us on the 19th of November, who said that primary legislation could conceivably be changed to help change up that scenario. For example, to create a specific set of offences of domestic abuse. You'll know that this is exactly what I've proposed in a private member's bill, that you could have domestic abuse, aggravated assault, GBH, etc., so that they could be excluded from an early release scheme. Women's Aid are backing that, for example. To what extent are you going to consider that kind of proposal to best protect victims and survivors of abuse under this scheme?
Yes, we are the government of the day. Yes, we control the primary legislation agenda. It would not have been possible on entering office, realising I needed to act straight away, to then pull in primary legislation mechanism that changes the law and then bring forward SIs that then seek to do emergency release. As you can imagine, there's not that many days to play with at that point. And changing primary legislation, even when you're moving at breakneck speed, is still going to take time, and of a time that cannot be truncated. And I'm sure Parliament, select committees and others would have quite a lot to say if in fact that time was truncated in a way that did not allow Parliament to properly consider the issues. So what I would say is that lever was not available and could never have been available on a timescale that would have allowed me to deal with the emergency release problem, because I was dealing with a decision needing to be made in days about which is the best lever to pull, and getting it implemented before Parliament rose for recess. And we did still sit a week later, as you'll know, but I needed to pull that lever, cross both houses by means of the SI, and have an implementation date for the first tranche of 10th of September. And in that period, everybody was working frenetically to recalculate sentence dates and then to start doing pre-release plans. So it was very much breakneck speed, I have to say, and any delay by choosing a different path, such as moving primary legislation, could have put us into coming back in September before that legislation has cleared both houses, then doing an SI, by which time, Mr. Babarinde, we would have run out of prison places. And at the point at which you run out, as I know this committee is aware, you're stopping arrests and trials from taking place, and that in my view is the end of the breakdown of law and order in the country. So you can't gum up the system in that way, and so that's why the pace had to be what it was, and this was the best available mechanism as well as the fastest available to prevent us from running out of place.
At this time, you now recognise that the scheme is set to be reviewed there's still over a year left of the scheme. That domestic abusers are being released early, and so the kind of breakneck speed excuse, I think, stands no longer. So are you going to look at this in time for the end of the scheme? And we don't know when the end date of the scheme is, but the government does have time. There is legislation coming forward, whether it's Home Office legislation or whether it's the Victims Courts and Public Protection Bill, to be able to make a change in primary legislation.
Well, I'll certainly consider any further proposals, but the government will also be responding to the sentencing review, who have been asked specifically to look at the treatment under our sentencing framework of offences against violence against women, offences of violence against women and girls. So what I would say is, in a way, that could be one solution if the sentencing review wasn't looking at how to treat the cohort of offenders that commit VOG offences, but because the sentencing review is looking at that, probably provides us the faster mechanism to try. I think we're trying to deal ultimately with the same problem. The question is which is the fastest and best mechanism, and I think having asked the review to look at it, it's right to wait to see what the review recommends and then take a view on what the best mechanism is to make any further changes. But I wouldn't want you to think I'm closing the door on the conversation. I've been weighing up as we've been going along what is the best way to put us on a sustainable footing for the future, and also to make sure that victims in this country don't feel let down, that they understand what's going on and that it's a system that they can have confidence in. It is very much working as we're going and a work in progress.
Thank you. I appreciate the door's open. I look forward to continuing that conversation. I'd like to ask briefly about the SI that excluded a further 6 offences from the early release scheme. These include things like breaches of stalking orders, sexual harm prevention orders, even murder in very specific cases, British nationals who committed murder in foreign jurisdictions who then deported back here. Why were they not included in the first place? I have a feeling the answer is going to be speed, but these are pretty big omissions.
Well, 2 things. We were moving at pace, and if you bring in a measure with no exclusions at all, that is the fastest way to move at pace, because then you don't have to worry about what you've excluded. You don't have to do a check of what you haven't excluded. It's actually, one of the options on the table was that one. I didn't want to take that option. I wanted to make sure there were some exclusions because I was concerned about the issue in relation to domestic abusers, and even if I couldn't pull every lever because they don't exist in relation to the cohort of offenders, I wanted at least to have pulled the levers that were at my disposal, which is to exclude those offences most closely connected to domestic abuse.
So that's out murder.
No, I've got two things. On the other offences, so I'll deal with the murder point in a moment, but on the other offences, this is actually a bit of a bugbear of mine, and maybe that of some other former lawyers on this committee. Parliament regularly creates new offences that are not that dissimilar to other offences that are already on the statute book. And usually everyone moves to charging, convicting and sentencing against the new offence. Occasionally there is still some old and outdated legislation that does exist and can still be viably charged, convicted and sentenced against. So it was a question of, these are very similar offences to those that have been excluded, but they're much older, and moving at pace, obviously we were able to pick off the newer offences that are the most commonly used now in these areas. but there was still this older, outdated legislation. And as we were tidying up, which I mean, in a way, I was very clear about this with the House, when I announced these measures, we were moving at pace and we would come back if we needed to add anything else in, and that's what we've done. On murder, that is a very specific, I wouldn't say quirk, but there's a difference of the way that murder is treated in this jurisdiction and what happens in some other foreign jurisdictions. So here it's indeterminate is automatically excluded. In some other countries, the sentence is a determinate sentence, and so where there is a prisoner transfer agreement in place and said foreign national, British national, returns from wherever they committed that murder and were sentenced, because of the way the legislation is framed, that could have been treated, because it's a determinate sentence, as having SDS 40 applied to it. And obviously that is not our intention, so we've excluded it. It's not a hypothetical that has been realised, but as we were doing this tidying up exercise, it was something I wanted to make sure was definitively had the door closed on it.
Last question from me. How many ex-offenders who were convicted of those 6 additional offences were released in those first 2 tranches? And do you plan to recall them now that it's the case that they would be excluded from the scheme?
They've been legally, they will have been legally released, so I couldn't go back and apply to them a standard that did not apply when they were being released. I believe the total number is around 60. That would be the difference between the older, outdated legislation and those that have been excluded under the new. So it's 60, but they have been lawfully and legally released.
Are you able to provide the committee with a breakdown of, among those 60, which of those 6 offences they aligned to?
Well, there's nothing obviously on murder. I would have to go back and have a look and write to the committee with an update on that.
One question, if I may, to follow that up. You've also, Lord Chancellor, double the length of home detention curfew periods, again to relieve pressure on prison numbers. The combination of SDS 40 and the HTC extension means someone given a sentence of 6 years would now be eligible for release from custody after around 17 months. Previously that would have been 30 months. And for a sentence of 4 years, eligibility for release at around 9.5 months. Previously it would have been 18 months. Are you comfortable with those release periods?
Look, what I would say is, home detention curfew is a policy that's been in place for, I believe, coming up to about 25 years. So it is a well-used mechanism that already exists. The previous Conservative administration extended it a number of times and quite significantly. I recognise this is a further significant extension. My first aim, I guess, is to ensure that we don't run out of prison places, and of the available operational measures to make sure that in this interim phase, before any changes that might come from the sentencing review are able to be implemented, and the changes are, the impact of those changes is seen within the system, is to make sure that the operational levers we're pulling are able to help us deal with capacity issues, but are also the right ones. And what I would say on HDC is it's been well used for over 2 decades. We know that the rates of recall and reoffending are much lower for those who are on a home detention curfew. I think the performance of HDC for managing offenders outside of prison is pretty good, and I know that there's not just domestic evidence from HMIP and others, but also international evidence in this space. So it's a reasonable mechanism. I appreciate that obviously when you look at the intention of the court at the point at which the sentences were being made, that does look like a reduction of the time in custody, but of course anyone that does not abide by the terms of their licence, doesn't stick to their curfew, will be recalled. So I feel like this is the best way to try and, again, square many of the circles that I am currently trying to do in order to not run out of prison places and get the system to a position not just of stopping it from keeling over, but to sustainable overall.
Got some questions on sitting days from Tess Munt and Neil Shastrihurst. I'm not sure who's going first.
I think I'm first in the batting order, Chair, if that's okay. Good afternoon, Lord Chancellor.
Hello.
On entering government, you increased the number of sitting days by 500 initially to 106,500. In a letter to the chair of this committee dated yesterday, you said there was going to be another additional 2,000 sitting days. However, when the Lady Chief Justice appeared before this committee a few weeks ago, she told the committee that the Crown Court could have sat up to 113,000 during the course of this financial year. Given the government's commitment to tackling the backlog when you came into office, can you set out why the number of sitting days has been limited initially to 6,500 below that capacity level and still 4,500 below it?
Well, yes, I can set out a bit about the history of what I inherited when I came in, conscious that I'm speaking for a process that I was not a part of. The agreement on the 106,000 was reached between the previous Lord Chancellor and the Lady Chief Justice, concluding the Concordat process in the usual way, though the committee and I might have some things to say about the timings of that, but it was concluded in June, so during the period of the short campaign in the general election. When the letters were exchanged, the offer was made of 106,000 sitting days. It was accepted by the judiciary. They had some observations to make about, some of the challenges that were presented by the settlement, but an offer was made and accepted in June of this year. So when I arrived in the department, there was already a 24-25 annual allocation of 106,000 sitting days. There has been, I understand, some questioning over what was the maximum capacity and what was known at what point. I don't think it's for me to litigate all of the history of those discussions between the previous Lord Chancellor and the Lady Chief Justice. I believe at the point at which the 106 allocation was agreed, there was an understanding that maximum operational capacity of the Crown Courts was higher, not at the level that it's now believed to be, but at about 109,000. But these modellings do shift, sometimes quite significantly in terms of what the HMCTS data shows. Nevertheless, in July, by the time I became Lord Chancellor, the agreement had already been set at 106,000 sitting days.
But is it not the case, Lord Chancellor, that the judiciary had actually listed trials for significantly more than that? Wouldn't it have been better to just give extra money and let it roll?
Well, what I would say is it's only possible to give extra money if extra money is available. In addition to my constitutional obligations to the Crown Court, I'm sure the committee will understand I have a wider set of responsibilities, one of which is to make sure we stick within the budget that we have been given. And for 24-25, what the settlement allowed, and this was the agreement that the previous Lord Chancellor made, was a sitting to 106,000 days. In order to provide extra, it would have to come from somewhere, so it would require a cut in something else in order to try and put the money into Crown Court sitting days, and it would require a cut in year in something else to provide that additional money. So I don't think it's irresponsible to, having inherited an envelope, a funding envelope, to say there isn't any additional money that's available and we do have to stick within the funding envelope that we have.
But setting your cap as means you just defer.
It's not my cap, Miss Munt. Just for clarity of the committee, the cap was set before I became Lord Chancellor at 106,000. Yes, so it's the cap I've inherited, and there is not the funding to, and has not been, to extend it, except of course where, and we may come on to this, the decision on the extra 2,000, small fluctuations in the budget, which we monitor on a monthly basis to see that our projections are what they need to be. I have given a very clear steer to the system, as it were, that I want to make sure that if there are any fluctuations that create some headroom, I would want to try and spend that headroom on Crown Court capacity wherever possible. And so it's been possible to move a bit now on the extra 2,000, just as when I entered office, it was possible to add in the extra 500 sitting days that we did.
Can I just pick up on that point?
Yes.
Because you increased the capacity by 500 when you came in.
Yes.
We all know that court listings get overbooked, and then the courts have to adjust accordingly to the number of sitting days that they are ascribed. So inevitably, court listings were cancelled and vacated as a consequence. You've now increased that capacity further, but of course those listings have already been vacated. What assessment has been made to determine whether they can be relisted within this financial year? Because you're pushing back the access to justice for the victims of these crimes and for the just disposal of these hearings.
Well, that's why I think the first thing I would say is it's important to make sure we're not in a position where there is overlisting against the agreed allocation. And as I say, it's not for me to litigate everything that was said and done prior to the 5th of July, but clearly we've had an issue. I suspect it's got a lot to do with the timing at which that agreement was being made. It ran very, very late, and I've made a clear commitment that I won't run the process that late again. But it was run very late, and as I say, others will have things to say about how exactly the overlisting happened. But it should be avoided at all costs, because exactly this point occurs that dates are set and then they have to be cancelled, and I don't want us to be in that position again. I'll do everything in my power to prevent that from happening going forward. There's limited what I could do having come in July myself. So that's the first point I would say. Secondly, on entering office, I asked HMCTS and MOJ to look at whether there was anything more we could do in our 24-25 settlement to increase capacity in the Crown. And that's when I was advised that at HMCTS there was enough money to absorb the cost of an additional 500. One thing the committee should be aware of, it's not just the cost within HMCTS, so the cost of the court, the judges, running a court, for example, but it's actually also the consequential cost of legal aid, which also has to be available. And legal aid is the responsibility of the MOJ, not HMCTS. But the MOJ advised me there was enough money, or we would be able to absorb the cost of 500 sitting days, both the HMCTS side as well as the legal aid cost. I then also asked, as a clear steer to the system, that if there were any other fluctuations that enabled additional choices to be made, where I could fulfill my priority of going as far as I can on the Crown Court and sitting days, then I wanted to be aware of them at the earliest opportunity. Just over 2 weeks ago, I was advised that there was some additional headroom expected due to, what I would say are standard fluctuations in budget, but that might give me the capacity to sit more in Crown Court this year. I've asked HMCTS to give me an indication of what can physically be achieved between now and the end of March, and I am advised, and I have received assurances that the 2,000, which I've made allocation for, can be sat.
So you're in negotiation now already? For next year's element.
Next year's Concordat. So the process for next year's Concordat has already begun. There is a big data and modelling phase, and then we move into negotiation with HMCTS. The board are involved, and myself and the Lady Chief Justice.
Thank you. And do you anticipate concluding those negotiations?
Well, I would like, and I am pushing from my side of the system for a resolution by the end of January, beginning of February of next year.
A couple of points, if I may, just follow up on. You told the House that you were funding the additional 500 sitting days. When the Lady Chief Justice came before us, she told us that there was actually no additional funding, and the funding came from the existing allocation to HMCTS. So can you just clarify for me whether that funding for those additional 500 days was from additional Treasury funding, or was it from the existing allocation, and likewise the 2,000 additionals that have been...
So this is a point I've just made in my previous answer. On the sitting days, when it comes to funding, there is the cost of running the court, judicial salaries, salaries of other staff, running the building, and then there is the consequential cost of legal aid. So the HMCTS element of the cost for the 500 came from within the HMCTS existing allocation. I believe that's what the Lady Chief Justice was referring to. That was around £1 million or so. But the consequential legal aid cost of that was just over £3 million, and that was met by the MOJ. So that did not come from HMCTS funding that was from wider MOJ budgets, and I made a decision to prioritise absorbing that cost so that we could get up to the additional 500 days.
Go on.
Okay,
Go
so
on,
I was just going to ask about whether you have considered, or what consideration you have given to multi-year agreements, so this kind of shambles doesn't happen again, because it's going to give certainty.
Oh, well, look, I'm absolutely looking at every part of this process, given where we were in the year and the necessity of starting the next process and getting the agreed allocation for 25-26. What I've committed to on change is getting it done quicker, so we don't have this issue around, delay and possible overlisting, and also being more transparent, which I'm considering at the moment. Headline numbers on sitting days, but I would like to go a bit further so that there is greater public information about what's actually going on and what funding in the round is being made available. But that's a transparency point that I will come back to the committee with an update on, because I want to be more transparent than the process currently has been. I think going further forward, there is a question about multi-year, which I would be willing to consider and will consider. I think there is an element of it, though, which is necessarily an annual process, because your capacity might shift year to year, your demand levels might shift year to year. You want to make sure that of the allocation that you have, you're getting absolute maximum bang for your buck, as it were, because this is public money, and we've got to attain value for money and make sure that we're squeezing out every bit of capacity that we think the system can and should be delivering. So I suspect there is an element of it that will require always an annual aspect and annual adjustments, even if you move to a more multi-year process. But I'm absolutely considering now the sort of more medium to long-term changes we might make to this process.
What does medium to long-term mean?
Well, we've got to conclude the 25-26 one more quickly than would allow for a proper look at. Yes, that's more urgent, and as I say, my steer to the system and everything that I'm pushing is I would like this concluded by the end of January, beginning of February of next year. And I would want to be more transparent on that, and then I would want to think very carefully about what the next one looks like.
3 years?
Well, so I mean, there is a spending review process as well, which might helpfully align with anything that we might want to say on a multi-year basis. I don't want to get ahead of that. I would just assure the committee it's something I'm looking at, and I'd happily return to
Just making
discuss.
the point that actually victims and witnesses are looking at 27, 28, 2027, 2028. It's a very long way ahead, and they will want certainty that there's some end to all of this.
Absolutely, and that is why I made very clear to the department when I entered in July that for 24-25 I wanted any change that was positive in terms of headroom to make sure that I was maximising what I could achieve in the Crown Court, because I'm very conscious as a constituency member of Parliament. I know many people myself caught in this system as victims, and the situation is intolerable for them, and I have every empathy with that, and I'm pushing the system to try and deliver better for all concerned, especially victims. I think for the more medium to long term, in fact, what I would say is the backlog, the Crown Court backlog, is going to go up because we know that demand coming into the system, even with disposals at a very high rate, and judges cracking through disposals as fast as they can, there's still a huge mismatch, and that's why I've announced the Leveson review, because I think we are going to have to think about policy solutions that we can implement, policy reforms that we can implement in order to ultimately do better by victims, get that backlog down, and get the system moving in a more timely way.
Just got one last question, if I may, Chair, and that's about the metric for measuring or setting capacity in Crown Courts. And we use sitting days as the current standard, but of course we know that judges' work goes much beyond having parties in front of them. There's box work, there's judgment writing, etc. And the Lady Chief Justice questioned whether the sitting days was the right metric. I'm interested, and I'm sure the committee is, on your views whether that is the long-term unit of measure, or what other options would be available?
Indeed, to sitting day or not to sitting day. Well, having got myself across all the ways in which sitting days are defined across the different jurisdictions, and they do vary in order to take account of the specific features of the different courts and tribunals that we have. would you necessarily start with a sitting day? Maybe not, is my first observation. It is a technically complicated and complex exercise by which we arrive at what we think is the capacity of the courts. I guess from a first principles point, I would say we do need some measure. So there has to be some way reliably of capturing what is the activity that we expect for the public funding that goes into the system. It is public money, it's taxpayers' money at the end of the day. So there has to be a mechanism by which you are able to hold accountable every player in the system for spending that money wisely and on the things that people would expect. So there has to be a mechanism. And of the two available at the moment, there are sitting days and disposals. And I am very sympathetic to the Lady Chief and others who will say it doesn't necessarily capture all of the work that judges are doing. And, you know, I meet many judges, people will tell me, and I know myself as a former barrister, that there is a wider level of work that goes on as well, and there is an argument for looking at how we best capture that within the methodology and the measures that we use. I'm willing to have that conversation, and I think that given that Sir Brian Levison's going to look at efficiencies in the system as well, there's a useful moment at which to interrogate. Again, if you're designing the system from scratch and you have public money and your absolute first principles approach is to have accountability for that money, what is the best way of having a metric that measures that? I'm willing to engage in that conversation. It's just that I have a slight hesitancy only because it's difficult at the moment to work out, if you don't have sitting days and if you don't have disposal rates, what else it would be. And I think actually this was captured in the Lady Chief's evidence to you as well, which is it's not obvious what your other measure would be, but I'm absolutely willing to look at it, and if anybody has any better ideas, I am all ears.
Two very quick practical questions for me on this. Firstly, how much money have you found, either MOJ or
for the 2,000?
For the 2,000, given that, as I understand it, you will have the legal aid costs, you will have the administrative costs, but you're using salaried judges who presumably are already being paid. So how many?
Yes, so because it's for salaried judges, the sort of what you might term the HMCTS running the system cost is around £1 million. The consequential legal aid cost, I believe, is just over £8 million. So the total cost comes in at about £9 million. I
mean, for the 2,000 days. Thank you. It's obviously very welcome news, but you've only got the last quarter of the financial year to spend it, and most of the decisions on postponing trials have gone ahead. So how in practice is this going to work now?
I mean, the advice I received from HMCTS is that it is the 2,000 sittings between now and the end of the year. The additional sitting days is a viable number to be delivered. I appreciate it's late in the day. I mean, look, if a headroom emerges in year, there's always a choice about what you spend that headroom on, and I mean, I guess I could have made a different decision to spend the headroom on something else potentially, but I'm very clear that I want to make progress on Crown Court sitting days wherever possible. And I knew that sending that steer to the system might mean that, you know, we were potentially able to increase, but it would happen fairly late. But I thought that's still better than not taking that decision, if you see what I mean. It's not. None of this is ideal. In an ideal scenario, you wouldn't have concluded the decision in June, and you'd be doing it much earlier in the process. But given where we are, I'm comfortable with the choice I've made, which is any capacity or headroom available that assists in getting the Crown Court sitting days up, I will take.
Thank you. And on the related topic of court backlogs,
Yes, thank you. You're on record, Lord Chancellor, as saying that justice delayed is justice denied, and I would certainly agree with that. And as my colleague has said, the committee is aware that cases are now being listed to take place in 2027. The government committed in the King's speech to fast-tracking rape cases, but that's against a backdrop of an average wait for rape victims of 48 weeks for their trial to be heard. So what can be done to improve this situation for victims in my constituency of Amber Valley and across the UK to improve that picture for them in terms of waiting?
Well, look, I mean, firstly, as I just said in relation to previous answer, I recognise the real life consequences of having a Crown Court backlog. I'm a constituency member of Parliament, just like all of the rest of you, first and foremost, and I see the impacts of that in my own advice surgeries, and I have constituents who are victims who are caught up in this system. Getting that backlog down is an absolute top priority for me. It's why I've sent the steer to the system that I have, which is trying to maximise as much as possible within the funding envelope I have the sittings that we can make available in the Crown Court, and I've been pleased to make a bit more progress on that in the last day or so. But I believe that fundamental reform is actually required because the backlog is big. It's at 73,000. It's probably going to get bigger because we already know that demand coming into the system is fast outstripping the ability to dispose of cases quickly, and the disposal rates are high as well. So, even with higher disposal rates, the demand is still fast outstripping those, and therefore the backlog will increase. So, I then have to ask myself a separate question, is what are the other big changes that we can make here? And inevitably you have to look at a process of reform of the sorts of cases that go into the Crown Court all of that side of the equation, I guess. And that's why I've asked Sir Brian Everson to look at both policy changes as well as efficiency. I do think you have to look at both. Is it possible to make changes on the efficiency side that help cases move through the system faster and therefore enable us to get cases done more quickly, but then also what can we do from a policy and reform side that helps us get this backlog down? And that's inevitably got to look at reform of what the Crown Court does and does not do, and that's what I've asked Sir Brian to do.
Thank you. You mentioned the current statistic of 73,000, just over, cases in the Crown Court backlog, and I think that was increased when the official statistics came out. I think it was originally 67,500, just over originally, and you've said that the Crown Court backlog you're expecting to increase this year. How will the department ensure that there aren't any quality issues in the way that we've seen when the official statistics came out for future statistics, so that modelling going forward can be more accurate?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's why we took the time in order to make sure that when the Crown Court statistics were published, we were very confident they had been quality assured by independent auditors as well. The number, as it happens, hasn't changed very much, as you've noted in your question, but I think it was important to make sure that this is a robust set of data that we can all rely upon. When I entered office, actually at that point, the data issue had just been discovered. And the data issue, I believe, was discovered because the senior presiding judge and others, having made a decision to, rightly in my view, to fast track or make more progress on older cases in the system that had been sitting there for 2 years or longer, try and prioritise those for listings, had discovered there was a discrepancy, so some of those cases no longer existed, and so that's what had originally alerted people to the idea that there was an issue with what was being counted and whether the systems were up to scratch or not. And then a number of other issues then came to the fore, some on human error of closing some files or leaving others open when they needed to have been closed, as well as this two sets of statistics with two completely different methodologies for what counts. So I think it's actually right that we took some time to iron out all of those issues, having discovered that they were there, move to one methodology that applies, to unify that, then to have it quality assured by independent assessors, so that now what is in the public domain can be relied upon. I think it was right that we took the time to do that, but I am confident in this number, and I'm very alive to any possible future data issues, and will be I can assure the committee I'll be onto it like a shot myself, but I feel like we've taken the time to get this right now.
That does sound reassuring, so thank you for the work that you've done on that. Can I move on to magistrate court backlog,
Yes.
which I think, if I may say, gets discussed a little bit less.
Yes.
But I am conscious that we've extended, or the government have extended magistrates' sentencing powers. So I'm just wondering how many additional cases the magistrates' courts can effectively manage, given that their backlog is over 333,000 now, which I think has increased 22% on the previous year. So what can the government do to support magistrates' courts, given the situation that they're in as well?
Well, firstly, thank you for your question, because it gives me a good opportunity to pay tribute to the tremendous work done by the magistracy and our magistrates' court system. And I'm sure members of the committee will have own professional experience. I mean, 90% of all criminal cases go to the magistrates' court. They hear over around a million or so cases every year. In that context, I think their backlog numbers are actually, have a different character to what's happening in the Crown. And before extending the sentencing powers, obviously I wanted to make sure the capacity was there to do that, and I'm assured that it is, and I'm not anticipating any additional issues for the MAGS courts to be able to deal with the cases that are now coming their way as a result of the increase in powers. It was a measure that was implemented by the previous Conservative administration as well, so they had also increased magistrate sentencing powers from 6 months to 12 months, and in fact the reason that they then sort of switched that power off, as it were, and dropped back down to 6 months on sentencing powers was because of prison capacity. So the issue was not courts' capacity or magistrates' ability to handle the extra work that was coming their way. It was in fact on prisons. It's a good reminder that it's an end-to-end system, and changes of policy in one area have a downstream impact on other areas of the system as well. But I'm confident, having switched the change back on, as it were, and gone back up to 12 months, that the system can handle that.
And that actually brings me nicely on to my last question, in terms of the impact that extending the sentencing powers for magistrates has had. Is there any evidence yet that it's had an impact on the remand population, on court sitting days, and or on prison places as yet?
Well, so it's a little early to have done that assessment, particularly on remand. So it's something I'll be following very closely, given the size of the remand population. It's one of the drivers for wanting to make this change, but it's too early to say. On the Crown Court sitting days, I mean, it is expected to yield the equivalent of 2,000 places in steady state. I think that is pretty much bolted on and based on previous experience as well. So I wouldn't anticipate that changing. On the fluctuation of what impact it makes on the remand population and prison places, I think at some early next year would be a reasonable time to start beginning to assess whether it's coming in at the sort of projections that we had made when we brought the change in.
Watch this space.
Watch this space, yes, correct.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the letter you sent last night, Lord Chancellor, in relation to sitting days, the sentence that stuck out to me was, due to rising demand at all possible sitting day levels, the open caseload would increase. So even going to capacity, and going to what the Lady Chief Justice would desirably like, that leaves us in a situation whereby it looks like the Leveson Review, which you mentioned a couple of times, is going to fulfil the same role for the court's backlog as the HoC Review is going to for freeing up prison places. But the sort of policies that are being talked, sort of ideas that are being suggested here are extremely radical. We're talking about not allowing appeals from magistrates' courts, about either way offences becoming summary offences, about an intermediate court. That's a massive administrative change. That's the biggest for more than 50 years since we had the assizes, and big constitutional changes as well. Are you comfortable that enough time is being given to this process? There'll be enough opportunity to consult and to reach a measured judgment on this?
I mean, it's partly the sort of tragedy of the inheritance, I guess, that even with all of the money available to sit at maximum operational capacity and go absolutely hell for leather, it's still not enough. And you're right to observe, I think, Chair, that in a way, therefore, the Leveson review is not dissimilar in terms of the scale of the challenge that we're facing as the sentencing review, where it's true that however fast you go on building prison places, you can't build your way out of that problem. You cannot build fast enough to keep up with the demand that's coming into the system. And just as I've been honest about what's happening with supply and demand on prison places, it's almost the same is true in the Crown. You cannot, it's almost as if you cannot sit enough in the Crown in order to keep up with the demand coming in. And, you know, if I look at the fact that disposals are, you know, high and the disposal rates are good and sound, and in any normal world you'd bank that and think the system's working great, and yet that's still not enough given how much more demand is still coming in. So it is time, I think, to consider broader reform. You know, to be fair to the previous administration, they would say COVID and the related impacts of the pandemic, the bar strike, is how we've got to a position where the backlog is almost out of control. But I have to deal with the system as I've inherited it, and if I know already that there is no level of sitting at operational capacity that could bring this down, then I've got to think bigger and think about bolder reforms to the system, and that's what I've asked Sir Brian to look at. In the end, you have to sort of, I think, reinterrogate what justice means. And, you know, justice delayed is justice denied, I think, is a very true thing. And, you know, is it right that victims are caught up in the system for years on end? It's undoubtedly the case that some defendants are gaming the system. You've heard evidence from others, like the DPP, to that effect. There's also going to be some innocent defendants caught up in the system who'll have waited years and years to clear their name as well. It doesn't serve anybody well at the moment, and therefore I know that we have to do something different. Is it potentially, are they potentially big changes? I wouldn't want to get ahead of what Sir Brian might recommend, and I've asked him specifically not just to look at overall recommendations that he might make, but the sequencing of any particular changes, you know, with this central driver that we want to get this backlog down and we want to have a manageable level of work into the Crown Court that we can dispose of in a timely way that ensures that justice is done. So yes, it's a lot, but it has to be done.
Aren't you worried at all? We've seen examples for the single justice procedure where moving towards summary justice creates problems. And this would be quite a rush towards restriction on jury trial, restriction on appeals of decisions, setting up new courts. Does it worry you at all that we might be creating new injustices or trying to resolve the current one?
Look, there's absolute premium on not making anything worse or creating further problems. Of course, I wouldn't want that to be the result of what we're considering or what Sir Brian might recommend. I mean, part of his terms of reference is also to make sure we don't compromise our principles around fairness and due process and what counts as a fair process for the hearings of, you know, what are in the end criminal matters. So I'm sure all of those very same issues will be in his mind as he is conducting his review and making his recommendations. I think he's the right person to be doing this review and has, you know, a very excellent reputation, but a huge amount of personal expertise that he will bring to this, and I have every confidence that what will result from his review will be a range of measures on which the government still has to take a view. We'll still have to consider the options that he makes available, but I am confident that kicking off this review with the individual who's doing it for us is the right way forward.
Thank you very much. We did a visit to the Central London County Court, which seemed to be a place of vast quantities of paper. And yet the MOJ's, the Ministry of Justice Digital Strategy 2025 says that its objective is to strip out paper, unnecessary hearings, forms and duplication. I wondered how that was going and whether you'd like to update us on how digitalisation is going.
So, I mean, let me say a bit, I guess, about the inherited position, because those were the previous government's programmes. I mean, I think it would be fair to say there's still a long way to go on.
Is it
further,
not the department's programme?
No, correct. But I would like to signal that, you know, ahead of spending review phase 2, we're looking at productivity, the use of data, further digitalisation as part of that spending review process, not just as an MOJ responsibility, but as a direct steer from the Prime Minister that he's expecting the whole of government to be looking at. So I think on what the future looks like and the further progress that we might make on productivity, on increased digital infrastructure and on data, the spending review process will be our opportunity, I guess, to put our own stamp on it with our own priorities. But I would agree, there is too much paper in the county courts. There's too much paper in the prison system. I think something like 5 million sheets of paper every month across the prison estate. So it's an astonishing amount of paper. And in fact, the other thing that I was pretty shocked by when I entered the department was when we were looking at implementing SDS 40, that you're looking at paper warrants, and it's a paper-based sentencing calculation and exercise. So I think there's a big piece of work here that remains to be either completed from what previous administrations have tried, and then also other changes that we as a new government would want to make, that I want to make sure that we crack on with. I think there's been some progress in the county courts on digitising money claims and damages claims, and I believe HMCTS's next sort of phase of that digital work is to move on to possession claims. So my understanding of the previous government's policy and working with HMCTS was to look at the prioritisation of the digital programme based on cohorts of claim types in the county court. So those are the biggest areas, and so the intention was to digitalise them first and then move on to other areas afterwards. So some progress has been made, but I think we can all agree that there's a lot further to go.
Sure. I just wondered, is there an envisaged end date for paper bundles to be not a thing anymore?
What I would say is we will set out our fresh look at productivity gains that we can make from further digital infrastructure and greater use of data, more cross-government working, and so on, at the next spending review process. And so I think once we're able to reshape what we've inherited in this space based on our own spending review priorities, I'll be able to come back to the committee to talk about the future and what that should look like.
Thank you. So just to pick up on the data point, so in July the Judicial Office published a report on data in the family justice system and said that the court case data, the new case management system under the reform programme, is not designed to monitor and evaluate the family courts. Are there plans in place to do something about that, to introduce something to develop a system in the family to deal with family courts?
Well, let me take away the specific on the data and what it can currently do and what apparently it can't do. I mean, again, maybe just helpful for me to explain our sort of first principles approach. You know, we think there is more that can be achieved with better quality data, using that data to monitor more, live what's going on in the system, driving the best possible decisions at the right time. I will obviously want to interrogate the data picture that I've inherited, and also whether that is the best cut of data we can have and whether we're maximising its potential to drive good policy decision making. In the end, you're not just collecting it. I mean, there's a necessary transparency element to collecting it and publishing it, but at a policy level and for ministers, it should be driving policy decisions that hopefully get ahead of problems and enable you to take a strategic view. And I want to make sure that the system we craft is able to do that.
Okay, and then when you're writing to the committee about that, then I think maybe you could let us know exactly what new data is available as a result that's already been worked. That would be helpful, thank you. And then I was going to ask you, so as I understand it, each department's been asked to find 5% efficiencies by reducing expenditure that's not aligned with the priorities of the department. What is not a priority in the MOJ?
Well, I hope you'll forgive me if I don't get ahead of a process that's only just being conducted. So the spending review process, as you will know, has been kicked off by the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. We will be carrying out a zero-based review. Understandably, they wish to see, set a target on efficiency gains, and we will obviously do our bit in that process.
So if we don't know what the non-priorities are, what are your priorities for the fixed spending envelope that you have?
Well, as you will see from the decisions I've been making and the range of measures I've already implemented, and in particular the two main reviews that I've announced, I've inherited a system, every bit of which is broken or about to fully and finally break. Prisons on the verge of collapse, a probation service that is already straining under the pressure that's on them already, and a courts system that is hugely backlogged, doing a tremendous disservice to victims and others as well. My first priority has to make sure no bit of this system completely topples over, which is why I had to make the choices on prisons that I did as soon as I came into office. I've got to then get us to a position of greater stability. And then my long-term vision and the reforms that I am looking at and the reviews that I have announced are designed to get us to a position of a sustainable system, end-to-end, for all of the parts of the system I am responsible for, from the minute they enter, which is the courts, and then out into probation. If we're looking at crime, for example, we need a sustainable system. That cannot, sadly, be achieved overnight. It is a process. It will take some time. It will no doubt, further down the track, require more difficult decisions of the order that the Chair and I have already been discussing. But this is a system under tremendous pressure and tremendous strain. And we have to turn it around. So reform and getting us to a position, firstly, of stability, and then onto being a sustainable system.
Thank you. So we understand that the headquarters has an increase of 66% of its staff. I think that's 3,000 extra full-time staff in the last 5 years, which is all about programme delivery, data and digital. We've heard already about the digital stuff, which we don't data. Just wondering, because the front line, which you described, the prisons and probation, is under serious resource constraint. So I'm just wondering how you get that priority sorted, and whether those staff whether the new staff are in the right place.
In a way, I guess this will all be part of the zero-based review, where we'll go through line by line what we're currently spending money on, and we will of course be looking at staffing. I would observe the vast majority of staff for MOJ are out in the community delivering services. They are frontline staff, so that whether that's probation staff, prison staff, and these staff account for a huge number, over 90%, I believe, of our total staffing complement. I think you're right that the HQ staffing has increased. Again, that was, I think, decisions made by the previous, my predecessors and officials at the department. I believe the rationale for those changes as they were made was around bringing in-house functions that each of the different agencies in the MOJ was carrying out themselves. So if they were here, they'd say that was an attempt at rationalisation of spend and making sure that the expertise is in-house where it needs to be, allowing those out in the field, as it were, and on the front line to carry on with the focus that they need. And there has also obviously been an increase in frontline staff as well. But I guess that is in a way, that is the inherited position. Going into spending review phase 2 will be the opportunity to interrogate whether that rationalisation has worked as it should, and all of the questions that you'd expect me to ask if I'm doing a zero-based review.
So there is a 2024 budget commitment to recruit thousands more staff, prison and probation. So how many thousand, and by when?
You'll already know about the commitment on 1,000 new on probation by the end of March. And I think on prison specifically, we're almost at, if not at full capacity on staffing, then we're almost at it. But I can write to the committee with the exact number. But you will all know, obviously, there is an attrition rate, and so you don't stand still, as it were, on your staffing. You have to make sure that if there's any gaps, you're able to recruit, and the funding settlement allows us to do that for 24-25, but actually more importantly 25-26. That will necessarily depend a little bit on what's actually happening in terms of retention. I can write to the committee with a further detail on that.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll bring in Alex Burris-Curtis.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from that, Lord Chancellor, I'm just wondering about your views, kind of your recollections from when you came in, and now your perceptions of the kind of morale of the justice team, as it were. And I don't just mean the headquarters, I mean, as you say, those in the wider kind of ecology of the system, the ecosystem out there in the community, because as you've referred to in a previous answer, we see it in our constituencies, the consequences of backlogs and the impact that has on our constituents. But not to speak for everyone on the committee, but from the visits we've done, we've seen it with the probation staff, the prison staff who are doing brilliant work, but in very difficult circumstances, and obviously SCS 40 and so on. We've seen, speaking with victims and so on. So I'm just curious about your perception of the kind of morale of what you saw the moment you're coming in, where it is now, and how you see that going forwards, particularly given MOJ touches so much of kind of our lives, and yet it is not a protected budget.
I mean, look, when I came in, it was very much an emergency situation, and it was a system of people under huge amounts of stress and looking at essentially going bust. I mean, that's a way of characterising what happens when you run out of prison places. What I was really struck by was it wasn't just people within the MOJ bit of the system, so prison governors, prison officers and other staff, probation staff as well. It wasn't just our staff, as it were. It was people across the whole of the criminal justice system. And I was very struck at my first criminal justice board, which I chair, which brings together all of the players in the criminal justice system, from policing, the barristers, solicitors, CPS, everybody. And there's also Home Office are represented there as well, that everybody was seized of the problem in relation to prison places. And in fact, we discovered soon after, over the summer, that in fact the head of the Met and other police chiefs were writing to the previous administration to tell them that they needed to make some decisions on prison capacity, otherwise the whole system would go bust. So the whole system was seized of the problem, and everybody was worried, and morale was low, and there was a sense that we are literally surviving day by day. I think having made some very difficult decisions, but having made them early and then tried to get us to a position of stability, I think that gave some confidence to the system, because at least something was being done and the problem was being gripped. And I've tried to give as clear a signal as I can to everybody across the criminal justice system that dealing with not just the prison's capacity crisis, but the wider crisis in the justice system is a priority for this government. And I hope that they are able to take that confidence from the changes that I've already made and the reviews that I've announced, with further reforms and changes to come. I'm not going to pretend that the picture out there is easy, because prison officers and probation officers, who I see a fair bit of, and I've been out to Stockholm recently and chatting with prison officers there. It's a tough job. At the best of times, it's a difficult job. We ask a lot of our people that work in this system, and they've been working under unacceptable conditions for far too long. I think people will recognise that we are trying to change things and that change will take some time, but there is a premium on me being able to send a signal that change is on its way, and so I am seized of that personally every day. For what it's worth, I will observe that every single bit of the system since I've been in, despite what I've asked of them and how difficult it is and how quickly they've had to work, they have all risen to the occasion.
Yeah, thank you, Lord Chancellor. We've been talking about Crown Court backlogs and the various personnel involved in our justice system. One of the reasons given for there being a backlog in Crown Court cases is the lack of lawyers. And I've got a few statistics here. So last year, 139 sex offence trials did not go ahead because the prosecution lawyer wasn't available. 113 trials were postponed because there was no defence lawyer. And this compares to only 4 times that this had happened in 2018 and 9 times in 2019. And the Criminal Bar Association has found that in 1 year, nearly 40% of junior barristers decided not to do any criminal work. A couple of issues are that, especially when it comes to rape and serious sexual offences, that the lawyers, the barristers are finding the cases to be increasingly complex, and they don't pay as well as other areas of the law. In fact, the pay is regarded to be quite poor. And you yourself, as a former barrister, will know that barristers only get paid once the case is concluded, so there may be some provision of having any interim payments being made. So you have announced increased funding for criminal legal aid, but is that going to be enough to get these additional lawyers on board to be doing these cases? And the increased funding for criminal legal aid is only going to apply to new cases. So what's going to happen in dealing with the backlog of Crown Court cases that we've got? Obviously I've made some changes already, as you've alluded to, Mr. Bousson, on Crime Lower and the £24 million uplift. What I'd say is, the first thing to note is the legal aid system, like every other bit, is of course under stress, and the previous administration faced legal action and had a bit of a history with the professions, as it were, on legal aid and pay, and for crime in particular. We've obviously made some quick decisions to try and stabilise the system. I don't wish to get ahead of any further announcements to be made, because I need to do that in the proper way. But I will be doing everything I can to take further steps to stabilise not just criminal legal aid, but also civil legal aid as well. I think the first priority is try and move to a stable position, and then I'll be working very closely with Minister Sackman, for whom this is falls within her area of responsibility, to think about any longer term changes that we need to make as well. You've mentioned civil legal aid, so you have, as you've said, announced consultation on increasing civil legal aid funding as well. And you've said that it's an important step in building rebuilding the justice system. So I understand that at the moment the proposal, when it comes to civil legal aid, the proposal to increase funding will only apply to immigration and housing cases. So what about the rest of the civil law area cases, and also is that going to be enough to have this access to justice for civil legal aid? Legal cases.
So obviously the announcement on the consultation, you are right, does apply to immigration work and housing. Of the very sort of broad picture of the civil system and civil legal aid, those are the two areas I think of greatest stress. And so again, trying to maximise what I can achieve within the funding envelope that I have, try to stabilise the system, so
trying to prop up the bits that are most likely to experience system failure. That's where I've made that choice. I obviously want to look at the broader civil system as well. You'll know about the review of civil legal aid, which I've been obviously considering very, very carefully. We will set out further proposals, I think, in the fullness of time. As I say, this will be a top priority for Minister Sackman and myself. Our challenge is obviously trying to make sure that we have an affordable system and can stay within the funding envelope that we have, but we've got to make sure we maximise that envelope to get the best possible coverage of civil legal aid and criminal legal aid to not impact negatively on access to justice. So it is a priority, and we're looking at it very, very carefully. I expect to be able to say more imminently, but don't wish to make any further announcements now.
Thank you for that, Lord Chancellor. Just so perhaps a couple of final two questions. So the proposal to increase civil legal aid funding doesn't currently apply to family law cases. When we had the LASPO legislation back in 2012, that did lead to an increase in litigants in person, most notably in family laws. So currently, what additional support is going to be available for those who are not entitled to legal aid, and what about organisations that may be able to offer support for those people, for those individuals?
So I think there is already a grant. So there is already some grant funding for those who are not eligible for legal aid, of which I think there's I can write to the committee with the details, but I think there's a fair chunk, between 15 and 20% of that grant, which is specifically for litigants in person at court. Look, I would accept that, again, if you look at what's happened over the last 14 years, when you make such big changes as the previous administration did on the availability of legal aid, that is going to have some downstream impacts, and we are obviously seeing those impacts play out. We will want to make sure that we have sufficient coverage within the funding envelope that is available to us, and whatever else we negotiate in the next round of the spending review, to maximise what we can get out of that funding for legal aid, stabilising the system, moving it to a position almost exactly as in Crown courts, and also in the prison system, going from stability to longer term sustainability. We'll want to achieve the same in legal aid, and I will want to look at carefully what the evidence is around litigants in person, and whether that is a further stress on the system, and whether other funding earlier might prevent some of the things that we're seeing. But that is a big piece of work that is currently getting underway.
So final question from me.
Yeah.
So thank you. I mean, it is reassuring to hear that you are carrying out a review to ensure proper access to justice. So any indication in terms of timescales? When do you think that we may have answers to everything that we've discussed?
Well, look, we'll be making some further announcements in due course, which speak to trying to get the system to a position of sustainability. And then in the new year, Minister Sackman and myself will set out a broader direction of travel on legal aid. Some of this will be spending review dependent, and we will obviously want to maximise our position, like every government department, on our settlement, but that will then necessitate further decisions, I think, on legal aid. But we want to make progress. We want a system that's sustainable, that does what society expects it to do, which is provide access to justice. We would want to make sure, we don't have legal aid deserts, that, the legal aid agency's job in trying to prevent those from happening and using its levers to make sure that there's full coverage, that all of that is working as it should. And as you'd expect of any new government, to the extent that we're able, given our funding situation, think about the longer term health of that system as well. That is obviously something we care about deeply.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. We'll go over to Alex Barris-Curtis on youth justice.
Thank you, Chair. As the Chair said, I just want to focus on youth justice for a few questions.
Yes.
Please, Lord Chancellor. So the first is just to reflect on the number of children in custody currently. So in the last decade, we've seen that number reduce significantly. I think, just checking my figures, in sort of 2014-15, it was 1,037. By 2022-23, that had gone down to 440. But of course, that reduction is not shared evenly across all demographic groups. I think the fall in 2020 and 2021, the fall of children and young people in custody who are white reduced by 86%, pardon me, but minority ethnic groups totaled only 60%. And currently, black children tend to continue, I think, to be overrepresented in custody. So it'd be great for your comments on that, and also what the government's long-term ambition is in respect of youth custody.
Thank you. So, I mean, on this, on what's happened in terms of the youth estate, I think it's one of the few areas where I can commend the progress made by the previous administration. We've seen a huge reduction in the size of the youth estate. I think that is very welcome. We're incarcerating far fewer children than we used to, and across government there's been a real push to divert children away from custody to try and make other interventions happen earlier that get children out of being that vicious cycle of getting caught in a life of crime, and then actually that's what decides their outcomes in life as an adult as well. So I think my start point here is that is a direction of travel that was set by the previous administration, which I agree with, and that is obviously progress that we have inherited and will want to build on. I think there is one of the learnings of that huge decrease in the size of the youth estate is, of course, of those children who are now still being imprisoned. You have a much more complex cohort. And I think it's right that about 70% or so of those children who are now in custody are in for offences of violence, and usually violence at the more serious end of the spectrum. So it's a very, very positive development that we're imprisoning far fewer children. But for those who we do imprison, obviously that presents a different challenge in terms of cohort. My priorities in terms of the youth estate is I want to run a youth estate that is safer. I mean, we know that levels of violence are very high. So our first priorities, and which I know Minister Dakin is working on directly, relate to getting levels of violence down and getting educational activity up. So those two things are fundamental and crucial. I don't want to read further reports of children being more scared now compared to what was the case in previous years, of fights breaking out, of staff being hurt. These are top priorities. We've got to be able to run a safe estate. It's smaller, but the danger level is different and the cohort is different, and that has its own challenges. So that's priority number one. Aligned to it is obviously on education. I want to make sure that those children are put in the best possible position to leave a custodial setting able to move on with their lives, having repaid their debt to society, and hopefully having sort of the support they need to turn a corner, as it were. So those are top priorities, and then obviously other things necessarily flow from that. So of course I'm interested in differentials. We know that there's already what looks like differential treatment between white children and black children when it comes to remand. So where similar cases lead to remand for black children that doesn't necessarily replicate when it's a white child. I will want to obviously take a bit of time to work through how we prevent that differential from occurring. But our top priority, I think, has to be on dealing with violence in the estate and on education, because fundamentally the whole system has to drive to getting those, for the children that are going to come out at some point, they do need to come out more capable of succeeding in the rest of their lives.
I appreciate that. And actually, on your point about differentials, we heard evidence in the DPP a week or two ago where he was talking about a review he wrote to the chair about in terms of the approach taken with charging on that specific point. So I think it's got to be an holistic approach.
It's got to be a system-wide approach because it's a system-wide problem. Exactly
right. Just touching on education in terms of how you tackle the kind of declining education, which was picked up by a joint review by the Chief Inspector of Prisons in Ofsted, and also the kind of tackling of violence and sort of lowering those levels to deal with these complexities that you've identified. What strategies or plans are the government employing in order to bring those into effect?
Minister Dakin is directly looking at the educational offer in the youth estate and where we might make some changes for the medium and the long term to try and make sure, again, for the funding that we have available, are we getting the best possible deal and are we achieving everything that we want to from it? The committee will obviously be aware of the new secure school, which has got up and running, which I understand is making good progress. And will obviously ramp up over the next few months or so, and we will want to evaluate and look at that very closely to see whether the outcomes there are better in that sort of setting than what we see in our YOI. So I think there's already some work underway that we have inherited that we want to build on. And we will set out more on the education within the youth estate, over the course of the next year.
Thank you. And in respect, you've mentioned the secure school. In terms of the last government, they had a commitment to close young offenders institutions and secure training centres. Is that a commitment this government, holds to, or is it contingent on the evaluation, for example, of the secure school that you mentioned, in order to sort of evaluate whether these alternative measures are actually working in the way that is fashioned for?
I have the same desire, which is to try and, further squeeze down the youth estate as much as possible and, longer term look at, if they prove to be successful, secure school type settings. I think now that one is underway, the appropriate thing to do would be to look at what the evidence shows us in terms of outcomes for children, because I guess that's the sort of crucial determiner of where policy goes here. But the only reason I wouldn't give that sort of cast iron commitment today and now is because, as I say, this cohort now that is in the youth estate presents different kinds of challenges, I think. And I would want to be confident that the challenge on violence and sort of really making sure you're able to make the interventions that are necessary to reduce that violence, not just in this state, but to help the children who are going in for really quite violent offences to properly turn their lives around and being rehabilitated. I'd want to be very confident that we've stress tested that fully before we make broader indications of further reductions that we might want to see. So it's not completely contingent, because there is a desire. I think mostly there's been cross-party consensus rightly that, imprisoning children is not where you want to go to as your first option, and it should be very much the last option on the table. But I would want to see more of the evidence on the secure school first, and also that we have properly interrogated what's happening with this particular cohort that has its own challenges before I think I can set a broader direction of travel as to where we want to be by the end of the Parliament.
Appreciate that. Do you have a sense right now in terms of the time frames you might be thinking about in terms of how long for that evaluation vis-a-vis the secure school, and then in terms of the broader approaches to tackle violence and so on?
Yes, so without wanting to speak for Minister Dakin, why don't I take away an action that we will write to you and give you a sense of what you can expect when next year?
That would be helpful, and if there is sort of an indication of milestones for when updates may be presented, yes, whether to Parliament or to this committee, and then Parliament beyond that, that would be very helpful. I think that's it. Thank you.
May I just ask?
Thank you.
May I just one very quick question, please? May I? I just want to raise one particular matter relating to youth and the youth justice system, and that is, if a young person comes into the youth justice system for something that has happened, and they go past their 18th birthday and find themselves being dealt with as an adult, is there a way of reversing that? Because it seems unfair if the delays in the system relate to 2, 3 and 4 years before anything is resolved. It seems terribly unfair that something you might do at 14 or 15, you are then dealt with as an adult come 18.
Yeah, well, I think, and you raised this at previous oral questions, and you've written, let me take that away and we'll come back to you with a response.
I'm alarmed that you have to think about it.
No, I appreciate it. I think it's a question of whether what you could do to change that situation. So let me come back to you with what commitment we might be able to make.
Thank you.
Going back to the secure schools issue, I mean, we've had secure schools of various kinds since the 1850s. They've had various names: industrial schools, approved schools, reformatory schools, community homes with education, and so on. So there's lots of evidence around how they've worked in the past. There's also a suggestion by the Association of Directors of Children's Services in the McAllister Review that a really bold thing to do here would be to move youth justice policy to the Department for Education and out of the Ministry of Justice. Other states do that, other countries operate the system through their education system. Is there any possibility of considering that?
That's not a conversation I've directly had with the Education Secretary, so I wouldn't want to make a commitment here today. Look, I can see why that case is made, and what I would reassure you and the committee on is that the ministers responsible, Minister Davey over in the Department for Education and Minister Dakin from the MOJ, are working closely together. And the government, of course, has its opportunity mission, which is about outcomes for young people. And both ministers from these two departments are looking carefully at the work of that mission. And what we might be able to achieve for young people who are caught in the criminal justice system. So I think there is certainly what I would say good cross-government working, and ministers are already engaged. Is there a broader question about where the policy area sits? I think it's a conversation, I'm not shutting the door on that conversation. I'll be willing to discuss further with DFE colleagues, and ultimately it'll be up to the Prime Minister whether he wishes to make a bigger machinery of government type change. Absent that, I would just want to reassure you that the approach of this government is very much to work across departments and to not, the Prime Minister is very clear, does not expect his Secretaries of State to be caught in silos and not talking to one another and not pooling resources where possible. So I can reassure you that the fact that it sits here and not at DFE is not a bar to considering best practice about how we make the estate function as it should.
Thank you very much.
Moving on, we're almost there. But, can I ask you, as one of your policy priorities is the Women's Justice Board?
Yes.
But what would you hope to have seen that initiative achieve by the end of this Parliament?
Well, so you might have seen, Chair, from my speech at conference when I announced the Women's Justice Board, again, going from first principles, I think we imprison far too many women. Too many women in the women's estate have been in prison for non-violent offences. Too many of them are mothers. And in too many cases, when mum is in prison, it leads to the breakup of the family home. So I think there is a wider cost to society here, which I would like to limit as much as possible. And ultimately, my broad ambition is to see fewer women prisoners and ultimately fewer women's prisons. That is the steer I have given to the Women's Justice Board. It will be up and running early in the new year when we will be setting out more of its work and its full remit. I'm very excited to be launching it soon. They will have some things that they're looking at directly for us. So particular interest in reducing rates of self-harm amongst the female population in prison, looking at alternative settings for women, alternatives to custody. There will obviously be a relationship between what happens in the female estate and the outcome of the sentencing review as well, which the Women's Justice Board will be very alive to. But very early next year, you'll see the announcement of the board, its members, and its initial work that it will start conducting. Once it's underway, and again, depending on the interaction that any of those changes they might have with the sentencing review, I'd hope to be able to set out more about where I think we can get to with the female estate. In fact, we've just been discussing what happened in the youth estate. I mean, you've seen a big shrinking of that estate over time. I think it's a little bit too early to say that, but I've started it and I've set it up with the ambition of fewer women prisoners and ultimately fewer women's prisons.
Thank you. And finally, we're going to start our first major inquiry in the new year on rehabilitation and resettlement. I just had a question to lead into that, but did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that I had in mind, Lord Chancellor, was that there is a view that although we do need to lock up serious offenders for the safety of the public, there is a view that we have too many people in prison. And could you give any indication as to how far you've looked into ways of providing punishment and rehabilitation through a non-custodial sentence, avoiding prison but still giving an element of punishment, but moreover providing rehabilitation without somebody having to go to prison?
I guess the first answer to your question is, given the position I've inherited, there is not in fact the luxury of interrogating from first principles what an ideal prison population might look like, or what this picture of sentencing has led to and what other change. In a way, I have a crisis. We have to do supply, we have to build, and we have to look at demand and everything in between. And that's why the sentencing review is looking specifically at making sure we've got the prison places we need for the people that have to be locked up. B, that we do a better job on rehabilitation, because you're exactly right. We are not doing as well on reducing reoffending as we should be, and too many people are coming out of prison basically better criminals than they were before they went in. And when you have a situation where 80% of offenders are reoffenders, you know you've got a big problem on reoffending, and you know your rehabilitation isn't achieving what it needs to achieve. And so that is a specific task of the sentencing review. And then finally, how we expand the range and the use of punishment outside of prison. This is a space where I think advances in technology can very much help give public confidence in our ability to supervise and monitor offenders who are outside of prison, but also where we can deliver what looks and feels like proper punishment, because it's effectively still a curtailment of liberty with strict conditions attached. My own test, as it were, for any further expansion of punishment outside of prison is it has to meet that test of public confidence. I have to be able to look my own constituents in the face and say this is a good system that you and I can both have confidence in. Because without confidence from the public, the whole system falls apart. There has to, I'm very clear that there are consequences to actions. And prison has a place and will continue to have a place. And that place is about punishment and rehabilitation. The two things go hand in hand.
Just very, very, very quickly. So we have heard of cases, and we've made a visit to Brixton Prison, and we heard the story there that people are going into prison who weren't using drugs, but they become
drug addicted in prison. Yes.
And do you have a view as to whether you think that there are people in prison who perhaps shouldn't be there?
Well, look, the driver of the sentencing review is about making sure that those people who have to be locked up, that there is always a prison place for them. Because if you run out, you're no longer able to make a choice between who needs to be locked up and who you can give a community sentence to instead. You've just run out of places at that point. You don't have all of those levers at your disposal anymore. So I don't start from an ideological position of certain types of people shouldn't be in and others shouldn't. In the end, sentencing, independent judges will make a decision on what is the appropriate sentence based on the case that they have heard in front of them. We need to make sure that the sentencing regime and its relationship to prison places is such that there's always a prison place for those who have to be locked up. Your separate point on those who become drug addicted in prison, I mean, it's an absolute travesty, the situation in relation to drugs in prison. I think you are about to have an inquiry, and I'd be very interested in engaging with you on your work. The real driver for policy, I think, on drugs in prisons has to be decreasing demand for drugs in prison, because we can make progress on cracking down on supply, so preventing drugs from getting in prison. And I'm sure when you're doing your inquiry, you'll see all of the changes on security entering prison, much more airport-style security, designed to root out drugs getting into prison, no-fly zones. You'll see the netting, I'm sure, designed to prevent drones. The reality is, as demand remains high in prisons, you can expect that they'll find another way in. So you're almost feel on stopping drugs getting in, you're playing whack-a-mole. And it's important that we keep keep trying to stop physically the drugs getting in, but that has to go hand in hand with doing a better job with the prisoners who are inside prison to decrease demand as well. And that, I think, means that it's a bigger space and much more usage of drug-free wings, getting in early in terms of help and support for prisoners who already have a drug problem and are in prison, and making sure that the whole system pivots towards getting them off drugs. That's good for them, but actually also we need to crack down on the supply that's coming in.
Where can we look for good examples of rehabilitation in prisons, given the Chief Inspector's just found that of 32 prisons he reviewed, only 2 were rated reasonably good or good for purposeful activity?
I think when the Minister for Prisons was in front of you, he did name some examples. Hatfield, I believe, Drake Hall, Rye Hill are the 3 that come to mind immediately, and I think that is actually based on HMIP reports. Why don't I write to you with a list of others that you can look to for good practice?
And I promise this.
There are some. I can assure you, Chair, there are some good examples out there. It isn't always a bleak picture.
And I promise, therefore, that this will be the last question from Josh Barinde.
Thank you. Yeah, I cut short my questioning earlier to make sure everyone else had a chance, but I can't stop thinking about those 60 or so abusers, people who've perpetrated breaches of sexual harm prevention orders, stalking protection orders, restraining orders, perpetrators of revenge porn, who, due to the oversight you mentioned because of the speed, have been released early, folks who would not qualify now. I just want to ask, were all of the victims and survivors of the crimes that those people perpetrated informed of their early release? And what support is being provided to them?
Well, so the usual arrangements on victim contact scheme or victim notification scheme will have been in place. I'm not aware that any of those schemes didn't work as they should in the case of the 60, but as I say, I can write to you with further details on that.
And would you agree that the 12-month, so victims will only be contacted under the victim contact scheme if their abuser has received a sentence of 12 months or longer? We know that there are abusers who receive sentences of less than that, and so those victims and survivors will not be contacted under the scheme. Do you think that this is something that needs to be reformed? And if you do, what steps will you take towards making sure that all victims and survivors, regardless of the length of the sentence, will be communicated with via the scheme?
Well, I think, I mean, certainly the schemes have been designed by previous administrations and previous members of Parliament campaigning on more information and advice being available to different cohorts of victim. That would be true. I think that once the sentencing review has made its recommendations and given us maybe some further proposals on how we look at offences of violence against women and girls, that is the appropriate moment to then also look at what the sort of broader picture on victims is as well. So it's certainly something that's very much on my radar. I've been discussing with the Victims Commissioner, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, and other campaigners in this space as well. It's a clear focus for the Minister for Victims, so we will return to the schemes we have and what shape they may have in future, given where we think we might get to with the sentencing review. But I think the sentencing review is the first opportunity to take stock properly to get to a coherent treatment of vague offences across the system.
But surely abuse is abuse regardless of the sentence.
I think we are in agreement about the principle. The question is what you implement and when, and what is the right moment to think about further changes. And if you're already looking at the sentencing for a cohort of offender, I think once we've got those proposals, that's the appropriate moment to then also think about what other system changes you might need to support the new direction of travel, if there is one, based on what the sentencing review says.
It only remains for me to say thank you to the Lord Chancellor for all her time this afternoon. Could I also just say thank you to all the witnesses who've appeared before us. Thank the committee, because apart from Tess and myself are all new members and new to the committee. They've been doing it for years. And particularly today, just to say thank you to our Secretariat, without which the show would not be on the road, and particularly to Chief Clerk Rob Cope, who is moving on to higher things after a number of years. And so thank you from all of us, Rob. That was wonderful, the support that we've had. I wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and I'll close the public session. Order, order.